Who are some badasses in history that school didn't teach you about? Gotta go with the Berserker of Stamford Bridge. A giant Norse axeman who apparently slaughtered about 40 English soldiers and held up their entire army himself, and was only killed when one soldier snuck under the bridge and impaled him, presumably in the groin. I was looking to see if this was here before saying anything. Also the Viking who killed the mighty leader of a big army in Scotland, and put his head on his horse while he attached the rest of the troops. The decapitated head's teeth somehow bit, scratched the Viking, and the Viking died because of an infection from a decapitated head. King Sejong of ancient Korea was so tired of the Chinese style writing, so he said frick this it and devised an entirely new form of writing that led to the modern Korean Hangul. Not the badass you all were probably thinking of, but the man was a genius for this. Gotta love an intellectual badass as well. Not what I was looking for, but still very much welcome. I like bits of history like this. Have you heard about the time where President Andrew Jackson has to be held down because he was beating an assassin? He came from a meeting at the Senate, I think, and while he walked, a man who people think was mentally challenged pulled a gun and shot Andrew Jackson. But the gun misfired and Andrew Jackson got so mad he began punching and beating the living CRP out of the man. The man pulled yet another gun which misfired yet again, making Andrew Jackson even more It ended up with the man being so beat up and Andrew Jackson continuing to beat him with his walking cane that a soldier had to pull the 67-year-old president away. Sorry for any mistakes on mobile, so formatting might not be good. If there's mistakes I'll gladly explain. Just ask. Lapu-Lapu. History books often cite Magellan's death with a passing sentence like died in Southeast Asia while circumnavigating the world, but Filipinos know he was killed in the Philippines by Lapu-Lapu in the Battle of Mactan. When Magellan landed in the Philippines, he made a deal with a neighboring king, Humabon, that if Magellan took care of a rival chief on the other side of the island, Humabon would swear fealty to the King of Spain. Magellan had no idea he was being used. Magellan initially offered not to attack Lapu-Lapu if he bowed to both Humabon and the King of Spain. Lapu-Lapu refused and Magellan marched over with his heavily armed and armored men and was thoroughly thrashed by hundreds of Filipino warriors with swords. Lapu-Lapu is now a national symbol against Western colonization, but I don't think anyone in the US is keen to put him in a textbook. Really. The only mention of the US in the Philippines I got was boiled down to saved y'all from the Spanish. Conveniently left out Philippine-American War. America allied with the Philippines to drive the Spanish out, and when the Spanish surrendered, the Spanish basically handed then Philippines over to the US as the new colonizers. They then spent 5 more years quashing rebellions of outraged Filipinos. After the war, they introduced the US education system and rewrote the whole history for a new generation. Fun fact, the .45 Act was invented because Moro tribes in the South kept hacking up American soldiers in the Philippine-American War. They had to invent a whole new bullet with more stopping power, because the tribesmen kept charging American soldiers and cutting them down despite being riddled with bullets. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill also went by Jack Churchill, Fighting Jack Churchill and Mad Jack. This wondrous British officer carried around a long bow and arrow and a Scottish longsword during World War II. To top that all off, he also had some bagpipes. I watched a video about him. Mad lad went to a German trench with only a sword and all 80 men surrendered, probably thinking he was either a god or they couldn't shoot a guy with those balls of steel. They should make a video game about it. Possibly Balls of War. Leo Major. Canadian hero who liberated an entire Dutch city in World War II single-handedly. Honestly, Canadians seem all polite, but as soon you in war with them, you dead. On the topic of Canadian soldiers, there's the story of the native Canadian Francis Pegamagabo. He was a sniper in World War I who was mostly on it for the adrenaline rush. One such way he was known to achieve this adrenaline rush was to sneak into the German trenches in the dead of night, right past the sentries, and walk up to sleeping German soldiers. When he eventually got right next to their sleeping bodies, he would cut medals off their uniforms without waking them and return to his trench. Counting coup. Good to know the official name and purpose for what he was doing. The extracts I had read phrased it very similarly to myself above seeking an adrenaline rush. In reality he was doing it as an act of bravery and honor. Makes the stories even better and more badass. Kapitan Witold Pilecki, a Polish cavalry officer who turned undertook an insane mission to get himself arrested by the Germans and sent to the Nazi concentration camp at Auschwitz. He escaped to tell the world of the horrors, but no one really paid him much attention. This is just the gist of it, but the guy had some other amazing achievements. Qin Shi. She was a Chinese pirate who led a massive fleet of somewhere between 20,000 to 40,000 men, and ruled over the South China Sea and had influence in all of China's territorial waters. Her fleet stood toe-to-toe with the likes of the British Empire, the Portuguese Empire, and the Qing dynasty. William Billy Lee. He was George Washington's attendant slave, and as such, he accompanied Washington just about everywhere. As a result, he not only became an accomplished horseman, due to Washington being a top-level rider himself, but he was also in the midst of the fighting throughout the entire Revolutionary War, likely making him one of the first African Americans to be a part of that cause. In general, non-whites weren't allowed to participate directly until a ways into the war, if I recall correctly. He was also the only slave of Washington's who was freed immediately when Washington died, and he was given the option of living at Mount Vernon for the rest of his life, which he did. Unfortunately, pretty much everything we know about Billy comes from sources written only by other people who knew him, as he doesn't seem to have left behind any autobiographical data. The saddest part is, despite his valiance as well as being an attendant to someone as iconic as George Washington, him having been enslaved for most of his life is cited as having contributed to the somewhat scarce mention of him in primary sources. I never learned about him in school and didn't hear about Billy at all until I was about 29 or 30 in the past year or two, and it's especially disheartening that no writings from his point of view are known to exist. Teddy Roosevelt grew up with really horrible asthma. Just like me, he's one of my heroes. Compensating for his childhood illnesses was part of why he lived such an active life. Leroy Jenkins. This is just a Sabaton fan hot zone. Two that I haven't seen mentioned here are Larry Thorne or Laurie Tawney, a guy who fought in 3 different armies from World War II through to Vietnam, and the soldiers that fought in the Battle of Wisna, one of many battles dubbed Polish Thermopylae, in this instance, because the Polish were outnumbered against the Germans roughly 40-1. John Paul Jones. I feel like most people would recognize this name from oversimplified videos, but if you don't, he fought in the American Revolution and raided a bunch of cities. He was an absolute legend and helped the Americans a lot. Check out the vid for more details. It was the American Revolution Part 2. Heard he was pretty good at base 2. He was fighting a naval battle, and the British commander had damaged his ship to the point that it was sinking. He asked John Paul Jones if he wanted to surrender, and JP's response was, "Why would I? I have not yet begun to fight." He then proceeded to capture the less damaged British ship, move all his crew over before his own ship sank, and sailed back home with the British captain and crew as prisoners. Dude was an absolute Chad. Anadis was a woman living in Athens. She became tired of seeing women dying in childbirth, so she decided to be a doctor. Of course everyone told her no, because she was a woman, so she used mad acting skills to disguise herself as a man and enrolled in medical school. A few years later she finished studying and began working as a doctor for pregnant women. All the other doctors became antsy about this new doctor who was doing a better job than they were and accused Anadis of sleeping with her patients. At the court, Anadis stood up on the stadium and dropped her tunic, probably saying something like, "I ain't fricking your wives." The court was of course furious and was going to arrest her when all her previous patients whose lives she saved busted into the courtroom demanding the charges be dropped. The court couldn't really contend with the angry mob and granted a new law so women could learn to become midwives. There's some speculation as to if the story is real or not, but regardless, she's a queen and I love the image of her just storming to the center of the courtroom, yanking her tunic off, and shouting, "I am not fricking your wives, you pathetic bastards." That Chinese hooker who basically ruled the 7 seas. Yeah. Audrey Murphy. While the American Civil War was going on, China was dealing with its own against Jesus' younger brother Hong Xiuquan. Guy has a crazy story, and the conflict that he was part of was one of the bloodiest in history. In my opinion, whore. Matilda Gage. She was a hardcore feminist who also fought for Native American rights and was an abolitionist. She fought hard to get rights for everyone and was also really smart in fields like science, and the Matilda effect is named after her, which is the tendency to not give women credit for scientific invention. Crazy horse. Bass Reeves. Alan Turing. The man who made way for modern day technology by creating the first computer that may change the outcome of World War II. He was arrested because he was gay. Desmond Doss. A medic in World War II that never carried a weapon into battle. He was given the Medal of Honor for his brave work on the battlefield of Hacksaw Ridge, which is the name of the great movie about him, where he single-handedly saved over 70 lives under enemy fire. He died in the early 2000s. That one pig that crossed a border and the Americans went to war over it, lol.